Second language learning. Where do the errors come from? Now, if we realized through the error analysis phase that not all the errors were traceable back to the first language of the learners, then if the language that the learners were using as they practiced second language, if it was not like the target language, the question was, where were the learner errors coming from? This was a challenge that confronted the researchers and the teachers alike who wanted to understand and facilitate second language learning. So focus came to be more and more on the language that the learners were using rather than on the target language and the first language. But this began initially from the an analysis of the errors themselves, and there was an attempt made to understand them by comparing the errors made by the second language learners and by the type of errors that the children made when they were learning their first language. And gradually, by 1972, we have this Selinka who uses the term interlanguage for the second language learners who are in the process of learning the second language, but who have not yet mastered the target language. It was realized that the kind of errors the learners were making were systematic, and actually it indicated certain kinds of rules that the learners were using in their own language. So gradually it came to be understood that the language that the learners use as they learn a second language pass through this phase of interlanguage. It is a language in its own right. So one need not compare it with the target language, rather study this interlanguage itself. So another important part of this interlanguage was that this system, apart from being rule-based, was also dynamic and evolving. So it was not a system that was static, but it was constantly evolving. Of course, it is understandable that this interlanguage had to be evolving, since this was a process through which the second language learners were going through. So this was a process in which the learners were trying to generate the rules of the second language and apply them to the use of the second language itself. And these rules were not necessarily the same rules of the target language, but these were processed by the learners in the light of their own background information, background of language, and their own strategies. Now, interlanguage studies, which began from here, moved beyond error analysis. In error analysis, the focus was on specific errors that the learners were making. In the interlanguage, the whole system of the language that the learners were using came to be the focus of analysis. And we see now, by 1970s, late 1970s, gradually it will move on. And we see that there has been a shift from contrastive analysis, comparing languages, first and the second language, to error analysis, looking at the cause of the errors in the learner language, to the third stage of looking at the language used by the learner as a whole and considering it a language in its own kind, the interlanguage.